The hot sun of Nigeria was rising over the savannah, spreading golden light across the parched earth. In the village of Okori, nestled beside an ancient baobab tree, a new day was awakening. Life here flowed slowly, following the rhythm of nature and the testaments of ancestors. Ajo, a tall, sturdily built young man with a scar above his left eyebrow, was one of the first to leave his hut at dawn. His face, framed by short, curly hair, was focused, his eyes watchful, capable of spotting the slightest movement in the tall grass. Ajo was a hunter, and it was not just a craft, but a calling passed down through generations. His day began with gratitude to the spirits of nature for their gifts and an apology for having to take a life to sustain his own. He took his faithful bow, a quiver of arrows made by his own hands, and stepped outside the village boundaries. Every step on the hot earth was familiar, every rustle of leaves, every bird's cry, understood. The savannah was his home, his mother, who fed and taught him. He knew where to find drinking water even in the driest season, how to read animal tracks, how to move silently, like a shadow. Life in Okori was steeped in tradition. The elders, gray-haired men and women who had seen many rains and many dry seasons, guided the life of the community. Their words were law, their wisdom, a compass. Ajo respected these traditions. He listened to stories of great hunters of the past, of the spirits of rivers and trees, of how important it was to live in harmony with the world. He participated in communal work, mending huts, tilling the land, but his true element was the savannah. In recent months, Ajo's life had been filled with anticipation. He was preparing for initiation, a rite that was to transform him from a youth into a full-fledged warrior, a member of the community council, responsible for the protection and well-being of Okori. The training was exhausting. Long distance running under the scorching sun, spear fighting, studying the history and laws of the tribe, tests of endurance and courage. He knew that successful initiation was not only an honor but also a duty, that his life would change forever. But recently, anxiety hung over the village. The long-awaited rains did not come. The sky was empty, without a single cloud. The rivers dwindled, the springs almost dried up. Rumors of the approaching drought spread through the village, bringing with them fear and uncertainty. The elders prayed, performed rain-calling ceremonies, but the earth remained dry and hard, like stone. Ajo felt this anxiety. As a hunter, he saw that the animals were going far away, searching for water. The savannah, his home, was beginning to groan under the weight of the heat. This was not just a test for him personally, it was a threat to his entire world. His anxiety was not for himself, but for the people of Okori, for their future under this merciless sun. Initiation seemed important, but survival was becoming the primary concern. Every year, when food supplies in the villages became scarce and the need for exchange grew, a large trade market was held. It was a place where people from different tribes and villages met, exchanged goods, news, and stories. This year, the market was particularly tense due to the worsening drought, but it still took place, as it had been for ages. The village of Okori brought dried fruits, herbs, animal hides, and wooden crafts. Ajo accompanied the elders, helping to carry the goods and ensuring safety on the way. The market was noisy and crowded. Colorful clothes, the smell of spices, the clamor of bargaining voices created a whirlwind of impressions. It was amidst this whirlwind that his gaze settled on her. She stood near a stall selling colorful fabrics, choosing a piece. Her skin was the color of dark honey, her eyes large and expressive, and her smile, like a ray of sunshine.
Enkay. He knew her name.
The daughter of the chief of the neighboring village, Umwahia, a village with which Okori had long-standing ties that occasionally swayed between friendship and tension. Their eyes met. For a moment, it seemed as if all the noise of the market faded, and only the two of them existed. In her eyes, Ajo saw not just curiosity, but something deeper, a kindred spirit, a hidden yearning. She gave him a slight nod, and he returned it. That was enough for a spark to ignite. Over the next few days at the market, they sought opportunities to meet, casually, seemingly by chance. Near the watering hole, under the shade of spreading trees, during the evening dances. They spoke little, mostly exchanging glances that were more eloquent than words. Ajo learned that Enkay was betrothed. Her father, the chief of Umwahia, had arranged her marriage to the son of the chief of another, more distant but influential tribe. It was a political alliance intended to strengthen Umwahia's position in the region, especially amidst the growing uncertainty due to the drought. For Enkay, it was a duty to her family and tribe, a fate from which it seemed impossible to escape. Despite this, the pull between them was too strong to ignore. When the market ended and the delegations began to return to their villages, Ajo knew he couldn't just let her go. They arranged secret meetings. The place was chosen carefully, an old, almost forgotten path between their villages, near a quiet pool of the river that hadn't completely dried up yet. These meetings became an oasis amidst the rising tension. Under the cover of night or at dawn, when nature was still asleep, they met. They talked about their dreams, their fears, about life in their villages. Ajo told her about the savannah, about hunting, about his anxieties regarding the drought and the initiation. Enkay shared her thoughts on duty, on the burden of the expected marriage, on her hidden passion for knowledge and stories. Their hands touched, their eyes met, and with each meeting, the love between them blossomed, despite all obstacles. It was a love that burned brightly but fragilely, like a candle flame in the wind. They both understood the danger of their meetings. If they were discovered, it could have catastrophic consequences not only for themselves but also for their families and villages. Enkay's marriage was an important political act, and any threat to this alliance could cause conflict. Their feelings were forbidden, their happiness impossible in a world where duty stood above personal desires. But in those brief, stolen moments, they allowed themselves to dream of a different life, of a life together, free from the burden of traditions and expectations. This secret love became for Ajo both a source of strength and a source of pain, another test on his path. Over the following months, the drought intensified with relentless cruelty. The sky was relentlessly clear, the sun scorching, drying up everything alive. The earth cracked, forming deep, painful wounds. Rivers turned into narrow streams or dried up completely, leaving behind only channels filled with stones and dust. The village wells barely yielded water, for which people had to queue for hours, and it was barely enough for drinking, let alone watering the meager crops. The shortage of water and food became palpable. Grain reserves, which were supposed to last until the next harvest, dwindled before their eyes. Livestock grew thin, pastures burned out. Hunting became almost impossible. Animals had either died or migrated to distant, unknown lands. The gnawing fear of hunger settled in people's eyes. Tension between the villages grew. Neighboring communities, which had previously traded peacefully and even intermarried, now looked at each other with suspicion. Each village tried to keep the little it had for itself. Disputes over access to the last watering holes became more frequent, sometimes erupting into skirmishes. Ancient ties weakened under the pressure of hunger and despair. Amidst the growing crisis, Ajo noticed changes in his best friend, Kwame. They had grown up together, shared food, learned to hunt side by side. Kwame had always been a little more impatient and envious of Ajo's successes, but their friendship had seemed strong. Now, however, Kwame had become sullen and withdrawn. He avoided talking about the future, his answers were evasive. Ajo had seen Kwame secretly meeting with strangers outside the village several times. These were not local people. Their appearance was rough, their clothes unusual, and there was a glint of danger in their eyes. These were bandits, coming from more distant, chaos-ridden regions, who made a living by robbing and intimidating. They offered help, food, perhaps even weapons in exchange for something else.
For loyalty.
For information. For cooperation. Ajo tried to talk to Kwame, to ask who these people were and what they were arranging. But Kwame waved him off, saying it was just trade, seeking new ways to survive, that Ajo was too suspicious. His words did not convince Ajo. Ajo felt that something was very wrong, that Kwame had stepped onto a dangerous path. The growing distrust was felt throughout the village. People whispered, suspecting each other. Even among the elders, there was no consensus on how to act. Some wanted to lock themselves in, others to seek help, others to rely only on their own strength. The first hints of betrayal hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like the cloudless sky over the dried-up earth. Ajo saw how the crisis was changing people, bringing out the worst in them, and it scared him more than any wild beast in the savannah. His world, based on trust and tradition, was beginning to crack at the seams. Envy, that poisonous snake that can undermine the strongest friendship. Kwame had always lived in Ajo's shadow. Ajo was the more skilled hunter, more respected, preparing for the initiation that promised him a place among the warriors. Kwame felt less significant, and the drought only intensified this feeling. He saw Ajo trying to help the village, organizing searches for water and food, and this evoked in him not admiration, but a bitter sense of his own inadequacy. The bandits he was secretly meeting with skillfully played on his weaknesses. They promised him not only food and water for his family, but also wealth and power if he helped them. Their plan was simple and brutal. They knew that the village of Okori, despite the drought, had managed to preserve certain stocks of grain and dried meat, the result of previous harvests and the hunting successes of Ajo and others. The bandits wanted to plunder these supplies, leaving the residents of Okori to their fate. And Kwame agreed to help them, providing information about the location of the stores and the weak points of the village's defense. It was betrayal of the worst kind. Ajo accidentally learned of the plan. He was returning from an unsuccessful hunt when he heard voices near an old abandoned hut on the outskirts of the village. Through a crack in the wall, he saw Kwame, gesturing animatedly, talking with two strangers, the same bandits he had seen before. Fragments of the conversation reached Ajo. "Supplies, right here. At dawn, no one will expect. Ajo will interfere." His heart constricted with horror and pain. He heard his name and realized that Kwame was not just cooperating with bandits, he was betraying his own village, his own people, him, Ajo. He waited until the bandits left and approached Kwame with determination. "Kwame, what are you doing?" "I heard everything," he exclaimed, not hiding his indignation. Kwame flinched, his face turned white, then a mask of anger appeared on it. He understood he was exposed. But instead of repentance, he chose attack. "You're lying. You've always envied me. Spying on me like a coward," he shouted, trying to drown out his own fear. "It's you who's secretly negotiating with them to get power. And now you want to accuse me to divert attention." Ajo was stunned by this brazen lie. "How can you say such a thing? I saw you. I heard you. There was nothing. It's your sick imagination." Kwame didn't back down, his voice getting louder. "You all see how Ajo has distanced himself from us lately. He's hiding something. He's the traitor." They began to shout at each other, and people ran towards their voices. Ajo tried to explain what he had seen and heard, to warn about the attack. But Kwame was more eloquent in his lie, playing on the fears and distrust that already existed in the village. He accused Ajo of trying to sow panic, of wanting to destroy the community, of secret plots against the elders. The community was divided. Some believed Ajo, knowing his honesty and dedication. Others believed Kwame, perhaps due to long-standing animosity towards Ajo, perhaps out of fear of hearing the truth that would demand immediate action. Most were those who didn't know whom to believe, who were paralyzed by fear and doubt. The elders, confused by the conflicting accusations, could not make a quick decision. They decided to postpone the deliberation until the next day, strengthening the guard of the stores, but taking no action against Kwame. Ajo found himself isolated. His words, his warnings, were drowned in a sea of doubt and gossip. His friend had betrayed him in the cruelest way, and the community he loved and was ready to defend had turned away from him, or at least doubted him, at the most critical moment. The burden of betrayal and injustice fell upon his shoulders, heavier than any game he had ever carried from a hunt. He knew he had to act alone to prove his innocence and save the village. There was little time. The bandits planned to attack at dawn. Ajo understood that his words, unsupported, could not break through the wall of doubt. He needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would expose Kwame and convince the elders and the community. The only way to get such proof was to find the bandits Kwame was dealing with and force them to confirm his betrayal, or find something that linked them directly. Ajo decided to go to the place where he had seen Kwame with the bandits. He assumed there might be some tracks, perhaps even the bandits' camp nearby. He took his bow, a few arrows, a small supply of dried meat, and a leather water pouch. Without telling anyone, except perhaps his faithful dog, who followed him closely, he walked into the night, heading south, towards the meeting place. The path was dangerous. The savanna night teemed with predators. Lions, hyenas, wild dogs, they all hunted under the cover of darkness. Joe relied on his hunting instincts. He moved silently, stayed in the shadows, constantly listening to the sounds of the night. His heart was heavy with the pain of betrayal, but his mind was cold and focused on the goal. At the meeting place, he found fresh tracks, not only Kwame's but also those of several strangers in rough sandals. The tracks led southeast, towards drier, almost desert-like regions. It was a dangerous path where water was scarce, and the heat during the day became unbearable. But Joe knew there was no other way. He had to follow these tracks, even if it meant walking into the very heart of danger. The journey turned into a real ordeal. Day turned into night, then another day. The sun beat down relentlessly, draining his strength. Water supplies quickly ran out. The ground beneath his feet was a dry, cracked crust that crumbled into dust with every step. The air was hot and dry, making it hard to breathe. Joe felt his body dehydrating, his lips cracking, his head swimming from the heat. He faced hardships that tested his resilience. Several times he nearly got lost, but his knowledge of the starry sky and the wind direction helped him stay on course. He had to hunt small animals to survive, but even they were rare. He searched for water in dry riverbeds, digging in the sand, relying on intuition and knowledge of nature, but often his searches were fruitless. He saw mirages, lakes of water, shady trees, which disappeared as he approached, tormenting his thirst and fatigue. This journey was not only a physical test, but also a deep inner struggle. Alone with the heat and the silence of the desert, he thought about Kwame, about the betrayal, about his village, and about Enkay. Why did Kwame do this? Were the bandits' promises worth the ruined friendship and the fate of an entire village? Could he forgive him if he survived? He felt anger, disappointment, sadness. Thoughts of Enkay, of her smile, of their secret meetings were the only solace that sustained him. He thought of her beauty, her kindness, her predicament. This thought gave him the strength to keep going, so that perhaps one day he might have a chance to be with her openly, in a world where truth prevailed. Despite the exhaustion, the aching muscles, and the burning in his lungs, his resolve only grew stronger. He could not allow the traitor to win. He could not allow his village to perish. He had to find the proof. He had to return. Each step was an act of will, a victory over weakness and despair. The desert burned away everything superfluous from him, leaving only the core essence, survival, truth, and the desire to protect those he loved. Kwame was not a fool. He knew that Joe was smart and persistent. He knew that if Joe had followed the bandits' tracks, he was looking for proof. Kwame understood. If Joe returned with that proof, his betrayal would be exposed, and the retribution would be terrible. The fear of exposure and the community's wrath was stronger than any remnants of their former friendship. Kwame decided that Joe must be silenced forever. He met again with the bandit leader, the same one he had arranged the village raid with. Kwame explained the situation. Joe was following their tracks, looking for proof. He asked the leader to hire someone to intercept Joe in the desert and deal with him. The leader, interested in preserving his accomplice and avoiding problems, readily agreed. He assigned one of his most ruthless men, a mercenary with cold eyes and a scar on his cheek, the task of tracking Joe and killing him. The mercenary was an experienced killer. He moved fast and silently, easily following Joe's tracks, taking advantage of his ruthlessness. He caught up with Joe on the third day of his journey, when he was most exhausted, dehydrated, and vulnerable. Joe was just trying to dig for water near a dried-up bush when he heard a faint sound behind him. Hunting instincts saved his life. He spun around abruptly, seeing a figure lunging at him with a spear in hand. The fight was short and fierce. Joe was exhausted, but desperation and the will to live gave him strength. He dodged spear thrusts, trying to reach his bow. The mercenary was stronger and fresher, but Joe was more agile and knew better how to use the environment. He parried a spear thrust with his hand, getting a deep cut on his forearm, but it gave him a second to jump back. He grabbed his bow and quickly released an arrow. It hit the mercenary in the shoulder, but it didn't stop him. The fight turned into hand-to-hand combat. They wrestled on the hot sand, exchanging blows. The mercenary pulled out a knife and tried to stab Ajo fought back, feeling the blood flow from his hand. At one point, he managed to grab a stone and hit the mercenary on the head. The mercenary reeled, and Ajo, gathering his last strength, pushed him away and ran, despite the pain in his hand. The mercenary, stunned but not defeated, tried to pursue, but his wound slowed him down. Ajo, knowing he couldn't let himself be caught, hid behind rocks, using his knowledge of the terrain to shake off his pursuer. Finally, he managed to get away. He ran for a while longer until his strength completely failed him. He collapsed under a small rock overhang, gasping for breath, feeling intense pain in his injured hand. He had miraculously escaped death. The attack was unexpected and brutal. The realization that Kwame had wanted to kill him, had betrayed not just their friendship, but had wanted to take his life, was staggering. The pain of betrayal became almost physical, mingling with the pain from the wound. The injury was serious, a deep, bleeding cut. This complicated his journey. He had to stop to bandage the wound, using pieces of his clothing, understanding that his path to the proof would now be even longer and more dangerous. The cruelty of the betrayal was revealed not only in words and actions, but also in the attempt at physical destruction. Ajo was now not just a hunter for truth. He was a victim pursuing his wrongdoers, wounded but not broken. Sitting under the rock, with his hand bandaged, Ajo felt his strength draining away. The heat, dehydration, the wound, all combined could break even the strongest. He was losing hope, thinking that his journey would end here, in this desolate desert, far from home, having failed to prove anything. He thought of his village, of Kwame's betrayal, and of Enkay. Thoughts of her were a bright light in the darkness of his despair. And it was at that moment, when he was on the verge of losing consciousness, that he heard the faint rustle of footsteps. His hand instinctively reached for his bow, but the pain was too intense. He lifted his head and couldn't believe his eyes. A woman, wrapped in a light cloak that protected her from the sun, was walking towards him. As she came closer, he saw her face.
Enkay.
She saw him and quickly ran over, her eyes filled with concern. Ajo, oh spirits, it is truly you. Her voice sounded like music after days of silence. She noticed his injury and exhaustion. What happened? You're wounded. Ajo, barely speaking, told her everything. About Kwame's betrayal, about his journey for proof, about the attack in the desert. Enkay listened with horror, her face growing sadder. I heard rumors, she told him. Vague stories about you, about accusations, about you having fled. Then rumors came that you were seen heading towards the desert. I knew you couldn't betray your village. I knew you were seeking the truth. My heart told me you were in danger. I couldn't sit and wait. I told my father I was going to visit relatives, but secretly I set out to find you myself. It was an incredible risk on her part. Leaving her village, especially in the midst of a drought and before her own wedding, was an act of unbelievable courage or desperation. Enkay helped him reach a small cave she had found nearby. She had a small supply of water and food she had brought from home. She treated his wound, using herbs she knew would help healing, and a clean cloth. She cared for him with a tenderness that warmed his exhausted body and soul. Under her care, Ajo began to recover, slowly regaining strength. They spent a few days together hidden from the world. These were days filled with both the joy of reunion and the bitterness of their situation. They spoke of their love, which had grown stronger than all obstacles. But they also had to speak of reality. Ajo, Enkay said one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in bloody colors. I cannot stay.
They're searching for me.
My father, he made a deal. I am being forced to marry. The wedding is set for the end of the dry season. If the rains come, it will strengthen our tribe, give us allies in this difficult time. I cannot refuse without bringing harm to my family, my tribe. It is my duty. Her words pierced him like a spear. He knew this, knew from the beginning that their love was forbidden. But to hear it from her, here, after everything they had been through, was unbearable. But we love each other. His voice was hoarse with pain. I know, her eyes filled with tears. And that is the most painful part. But our world does not allow such love. My duty to my family, to my tribe, It is stronger than my own happiness. I am the chief's daughter, Ajo. My life does not belong only to me." She had made her choice, a choice in favor of duty, dictated by the harsh realities of their lives. It was not an easy choice. It tore her heart as much as his. Their love, which had blossomed in secret, now became even more tragic, caught between their feelings and insurmountable circumstances. They were together, yet incredibly far apart, separated by the walls of tradition and duty. Ajo understood her, but his heart refused to accept it. His healing became even more painful, knowing that the woman who saved him would soon belong to another. Ajo's wound slowly healed under Nkay's careful watch. In a few days, he had regained enough strength to continue his journey. Enkay could not go with him to the village of Okori. It would be too dangerous for her. They said goodbye by the same old path where their secret meetings had once begun. The farewell was bitter, filled with unspoken pain and impossible promises. Enkay set out back to Mwahia, and Ajo, with a heavy heart and an aching hand, returned home. The journey back was faster, as he knew where he was going. He also had something that could help. He had managed to find a bag left behind by the bandits, which contained strange, foreign coins and a small, carved wooden figurine, a talisman that, he had heard, was a symbol of a specific bandit group. It was fragile, but it was proof nonetheless. As he approached Okori, he immediately sensed that tension had reached a breaking point. The village was like a powder keg. The bandits had not attacked at dawn as Kwame planned, likely because Ajo had inadvertently disrupted their plans, forcing them to postpone or change them. But they had not retreated. They began to surround the village, launching small attacks on the outskirts, stealing livestock, intimidating the people. Fear and hunger were causing the residents of Okori to panic. Kwame, exploiting the panic, continued to sow doubt about Ajo. He told stories of how Ajo had fled, afraid of punishment for his alleged betrayals. He tried to completely discredit Ajo while he was away. Ajo arrived back in the village at dusk, exhausted and wounded, but with his head held high. His appearance caused a commotion. People stared at him in surprise, some with relief, some with suspicion. The elders gathered immediately. "Ajo, you have returned," the chief elder said, his face weary. "I have returned to tell the truth and save our village," Ajo replied resolutely. "Kwame has betrayed us. He made a deal with the bandits who are now at our gates. He planned for them to steal our supplies." He laid before the elders the coins and the talisman he had found. "These belong to the bandits I saw Kwame with. I followed his tracks and the tracks of these men. They tried to kill me when I was in the desert." He showed his bandaged hand. Kwame was present at the gathering. His face initially paled, but then he quickly composed himself. "Lies. All of it lies," he shouted, his voice full of feigned outrage. He wounded himself, or made up the story. He could have found that talisman and coins anywhere. It's all a fabrication to deflect suspicion from himself. "I told you, he was the traitor." He turned to the community. "Look at him. He looks like a criminal. He abandoned us in our time of need, and now he returns with some made-up stories." The village was divided again. Kwame's words, though false, resonated with those who already feared Ajo, or who were inclined to believe the worst in the face of crisis. Others saw the exhaustion and sincerity in Ajo's eyes and hesitated. The elders consulted, their faces reflecting the struggle between the desire to believe a tested, albeit suspicious, friend. Kwame was still one of them, unlike Ajo who had left the village, and the danger of ignoring Ajo's warning. The confrontation between Ajo and Kwame was not just a dispute, it was a battle for the souls of the community, for truth in a world where truth had become blurred by fear and despair. The atmosphere was so tense that it seemed only a spark was needed for violence to erupt. Ajo stood firm, his wound ached, but his determination to expose the traitor was unwavering. He knew that only the truth could save them, but convincing people who wanted to believe an easier lie was almost impossible. The village was on the brink, and time until the bandits' attack was running out. The spark ignited. Just as the elders were still hesitating and the community arguing, a piercing cry rang out from the outskirts. The bandits had attacked. They acted quickly and brutally, hoping for surprise and division within the village. Their faces were painted with war paint. They were armed with spears, bows, and machetes. Panic broke out. Women grabbed children. Men rushed for their spears and bows. For a moment, it seemed the village would be doomed, crushed between the external attack and internal doubt. But at this decisive moment, Enkay did not hesitate. Forgetting his wound, the accusations, the isolation, he grabbed his bow and shouted, "To arms! Let's defend our village." He was a hunter, a warrior, even without the formal initiation rite. His instincts took over. He quickly assessed the situation, saw where the enemies were strongest, and began giving commands. Those with bows to the roofs, spearmen to the gates, women and children to the center of the village. Despite the distrust of some villagers, many, seeing his resolve and skill, began to follow him. They saw that Enkay had not fled but had returned to fight for them. His actions spoke louder than any words or accusations. He led the defense, using his knowledge of the terrain and the tactics he had learned as a hunter. He shot from his bow with striking accuracy, hitting the bandits who were trying to break through. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Screams, groans, the clang of weapons filled the air. The villagers fought desperately, defending their homes and families. They were less experienced than the bandits, but they were defending their land, which gave them incredible strength. In the midst of the battle, Enkay noticed Kwame. He was not fighting alongside his fellow villagers. Instead, taking advantage of the general chaos, he was sneaking towards the edge of the village, trying to escape. He likely planned to join the bandits or simply disappear, abandoning his village to its fate. Rage at Kwame, at his betrayal, at the pain he had caused, overwhelmed Enkay. He rushed after him, pushing through the fight. He saw Kwame running away, cowardly abandoning those he was supposed to protect. Enkay caught up with him near the defense line, where the battle was fiercest. He tackled Kwame to the ground. The spear fell from the traitor's hands. Enkay stood over him, bow in hand, his face stern but not filled with bloodlust. He could have ended Kwame here and now, avenging everything: the betrayal, the attempted murder, Enkay's pain, the chaos he had caused. But at the last moment he stopped. Killing Kwame in battle would make him a martyr in the eyes of those who still believed him, or simply hide his betrayal from the final judgment of the community. Instead, Enkay pulled Kwame up, put him on his feet, and despite the pain in his hand, holding him firmly, turned towards the center of the village, towards the elders who were watching the battle in horror. "Here is the traitor," Enkay shouted, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "It is Kwame who brought the bandits to our gates. It is he who wanted to destroy us." He left Kwame to the mercy of the community. His act was not just a demonstration of moral superiority, but also an act of trust in his people. He handed the traitor over to those he had betrayed. Enkay returned to the fight. His struggle was not yet over. He fought with fury, defending his village, and his example inspired others. Gradually, thanks to his leadership and the desperate courage of the villagers, the bandit attack was repelled. The enemies, faced with unexpected resistance, retreated, taking their dead and wounded. The village was saved, but the price of victory was high. After the last bandit had fled, an eerie silence fell over the village, broken by the groans of the wounded and the weeping over the dead. The village of Enkay had stood firm. Victory was won, but its taste was bitter. There were losses: young warriors, old men who could not fight but rushed to defend their homes. The villagers gathered in the central square. The wounded received help. The dead were prepared for their final journey. The atmosphere was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and deep sadness. Kwame, bound, stood before the elders, his face contorted with fear. Enkay's evidence, his courage in battle, the fact that he exposed Kwame at the very moment of betrayal, all this together left no room for doubt. His treachery was evident. The elders made their decision. Betrayal of one's own tribe was one of the most severe crimes. Kwame was sentenced to banishment. His name was erased from the tribe's history. He was forbidden to ever return. His family also suffered shame, though they were not banished. Kwame was led beyond the village boundaries and left there, with a minimal supply of water, alone with his conscience and the dangers of the savannah. The village began to celebrate the victory over the bandits. There was dancing, singing, despite the mourning for the fallen. People thanked Ajo for his courage, for saving them. His status in the community was restored, and even grew. Perhaps now he could undergo initiation and become a warrior, a leader. But Ajo's heart was heavy. He saw the smiles of the people, heard their words of gratitude, but none of it could fill the emptiness that had formed inside. He thought of Kwame, of the ruined friendship, of how easily a person can fall. And he thought of Nkechi. He knew that her marriage was due to take place soon. Duty had called her back to her tribe, to her destiny. He had seen her last in the desert. Their farewell had been filled with tears and the recognition of the impossibility of their love. Now that the threat was gone, that the village was saved, he understood that there was no hope. Her family would not give up a profitable alliance. She belonged to another world, other rules. Ajo felt devastated. Victory brought him no happiness. He had saved his village, but lost a friend and a loved one. Life in Okori, despite the temporary relief, was still threatened by the drought, which had not disappeared. And without Nkechi, without the possibility of being with her, his heart saw no place for him here. He made a decision. He would go. Leave the village of Okori to find a new path in life, perhaps where traditions were not so strict, or where he could reconcile with his loss and find a new purpose. He said goodbye to the elders, to the few close people who had remained loyal to him. They tried to dissuade him, but saw the determination in his eyes. At dawn the next day, as the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, Ajo took his bow, quiver, and a small bundle. He walked out of the village, past the same baobab tree that stood near the entrance, and headed west towards where it was said there were other lands, other opportunities. His figure slowly receded, dissolving into the golden light of the sunrise, which promised a new day, but promised no happiness. He had been walking for several hours, leaving Okori behind, when he was overtaken by a young messenger, running breathless. His face was filled with horror and sadness. "Ajo, wait," he cried out. Ajo stopped, feeling something cold tighten in his heart. "What happened?" he asked. It's about Nkechi," the messenger barely managed to say, his eyes filled with tears. She returned to her village, and when the wedding day came, she refused. She said she wouldn't marry that man. Her family, they were furious. To avoid shame, not to break the agreement, they poisoned her. She died. Ajo's world collapsed. The messenger's words were like axe blows.
Nkechi, dead.
Poisoned by her own family for daring to make a choice, for daring to love him. His Nkechi, the ray of light in his dark world, no longer existed. He stood motionless. The sun rose higher, but for him, night had fallen. Despair, mixed with a terrible sense of guilt, tore at him. What if he hadn't met her? What if he hadn't loved her? What if he hadn't gone? Could she have survived if she hadn't known him? Or was this simply her fate, the cruel fate of a woman in their world? He looked back, towards the horizon where his village lay. Now he was truly alone. His friend, a traitor and an outcast. His beloved, dead because of his love. His home, a place he could no longer call his own, a place that reminded him of everything he had lost. Ajo, the weary hunter, who saved his village but failed to save himself and the one he loved, stood at the crossroads under the merciless African sun, with a broken heart and an uncertain future. The path ahead was long and empty.